Gordon Wiborg, and this is the Gordon Wiborg Show. Welcome to episode 3 of our show. Tonight we're going to be starting with where we left off last time, which is the United States Constitution. We're going to spend a couple of episodes here going over the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. We'll go over a little bit of the chronology of all that, and we'll begin working up the amendments with the First Amendment tonight. Before we start that, though, it's important to remember why we're doing this in the first place. In order to understand what happens today and tomorrow, it's important to understand what happened yesterday. We don't have to be historians, and we don't have to be attorneys, but we do need to have a little bit of understanding of what happened and why yesterday and in years past, so that we can deal with understanding what's happening today and how to better influence things tomorrow so that our United States Great American Experiment can be a better day tomorrow than it was today, or certainly yesterday. So tonight we're going to start out a little bit with the chronology of where we go with the American War of Independence and the episodes that happened after that. Please understand, first of all, I need to give you a warning about this and part 2 coming up after this in episode 4. I'm splitting up the First Amendment into a part 1 and a part 2 because we have an interview of an individual who's been impacted by censorship, allegedly targeted by social media by having multiple suspensions of his account. We'll go over that in detail prior to the interview, but the interview will come in part 2. Because of that, and we're talking about the First Amendment in part 1, I need to warn you a little bit about the language here. Some of the language that we'll be giving you will be direct quotes and will be right out of history, or in some cases, Facebook or Messenger. Of course, it's chat, sister. As we do that, I want to give you a heads up if you have any little kids in the room, or any adults who are acting like little kids in the room, or puppies or anything that you don't want to expose to profanity. When we get to that point, and we're getting there, then I need to give you a warning on that. So please make sure that your headphones are on somebody who isn't going to be terribly embarrassed or offended if we use some profanity. I'm a straight shooter, folks. I give it to you as I see it. I don't sugarcoat things. I don't use hyperbole. I don't make things any better. I don't make things any worse than they really are. I give it to you as it really is, and let you make the decision of what that means to you and how you want to think about that. That's up to you. You're the American citizen. You're the American voter. You're the person in your life who makes up the entirety of what's going to affect your future. Let's be real about this. Nobody cares more about your future than you do. Nobody cares more about your life than you do. That's a fact. And if you take your own life, your livelihood, your history, your growth, and take responsibility for that, then that requires you to do some work. I'm sorry, it does. And part of that is understanding where the American history has been. So let's start out talking about the War of Independence, because that's really from which the Constitution was born. We all know that, or should know, that the American War of Independence started in 1775, which is when the British King George III proclaimed that Massachusetts, the colony in Massachusetts, remember at the time there are 13 colonies that are British colonies, he proclaimed that the colony of Massachusetts was in rebellion in 1775. And that is now recognized to be the start of the War of American Independence, is how it's officially named. In 1776, of course, in June, the Declaration of Independence was written, and of course, on July 4th of 1776, the Second Continental Congress ratified the Declaration of Independence. In early 1777, the Congress authorized what was called the Articles of Confederation. Now we need to pause for just a moment on that, because the Articles of Confederation were intended to be the first United States Constitution. The Articles of Confederation were a loose, kind of less restrictive type of document than the Constitution turned out to be. It didn't take long after 1777 for the people, the colonists, to realize that the Articles of Confederation were inadequate for what they wanted to do with their emerging nation. So eventually they started working on the United States Constitution. Now that took time. It was 1777 when France recognized the United States as an independent nation. It's important to remember that France and Spain both came to our aid with secret treaties that we had with them to battle against the British. And in fact, it was a French fleet under Rochambeau who kept the British fleet out of the Bay of Chesapeake. At the time it was called that, which basically sealed Cornwallis's fate. And within a couple of months, Cornwallis surrendered. After the Bay of Chesapeake was closed down in 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. He was a major British general over the major British force on what was to become the United States. Cornwallis surrendered a month after the bay was closed down by the French in 1781. There were still 2 years until the First and Second Treaties of Paris between the new United States and Great Britain proclaimed the cessation of hostilities. In 1783, finally, the Second Treaty of Paris proclaimed the cessation of hostilities of the American War of Independence. So the American War of Independence basically went from 1775 to 1783, 8 years that George Washington, general then of the Continental Army, fought off the British invaders who were sent by King George III over here to quell the rebellious colonists. Of course, we know at the end of that, General Washington accepted General Cornwallis's surrender. 2 years later, remember, this is the 1770s, 1780s. There's no telephone, there's no telegram, there's no satellites. All of this stuff takes time. So, in 1783, the actual war ends. George III, the British king, accepts American independence. Of course, Spain and France had recognized us long before then. Now the Continental Congress has the job of writing a new United States Constitution. They didn't take the Articles of Confederation and cut and paste and change things. They threw it out. They threw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. I don't think that's what they said then. Contrary to some belief, the Continental Congress that looked at making this new Constitution, writing it and researching it, were not a bunch of drunk old men in a bar. This was months-long work. The entire Constitutional Convention took about 6 months. In that time, representatives of all of the colonies got together. They formed committees and subcommittees to write various parts of the Constitution. It wasn't all smooth at all. There were, in fact, 2 colonial representatives who refused to sign the Constitution at the very end. Everybody else did, and the Constitution came into effect in 1789. The same year that George Washington, who had resigned as the commander-in-chief, is now elected as the first president of the United States of America. The Constitution comes into effect a month after he is elected. Interesting timing there. He's inaugurated after the Constitution comes into effect. Now, this thing we call the United States Constitution, in order to get everybody who did sign it to sign it, the Founding Fathers, we think of them as, had to guarantee that they were going to make 10 amendments to the Constitution within the first few years of the United States. Those 10 amendments were known as the Bill of Rights. Amendments that are above that came afterwards, but the first 10, which we're going to go over here briefly, are called the Bill of Rights. We're going to go over each of those 10 amendments fairly quickly here, and then we're going to go back and take several of them in some pretty good detail, because they're the major ones that have to do with what we're talking about in this series. A word of caution here, because one of the things that is least understood about the Constitution is its scope or span of control. Keep in mind, please, the U.S. Constitution was written and still retains its original intent as to be a constitution of rights and protocols that restrain or enjoin the government. They do not restrain or enjoy individuals or private corporations. In other words, unless you work for the government, the federal government for the U.S. Constitution that we speak of, or a state government for the state constitution, unless you work for them, your employer cannot inhibit or violate your constitutional rights. That's going to be important. And we need to look into that a little bit deeper, because I know there's some of you right now who are going, whoa, wait a minute. That's not right. Well, I'm afraid it is. The Constitution enjoins the government and gives us, as individual citizens, certain rights, and we'll go over those, from intrusion by the government, from violation by the government. It does not enjoin my neighbor or my employer if I didn't work for the government. Now, forgive me, I spent 43 years in government service. So I'm not real familiar with working for private employers or private corporations. But I can tell you that a private corporation or private employers have virtually no vulnerability or risk of violating your constitutional rights. Now, there's a caveat there. Certain rights, which we call human rights, are not only in the Constitution, but they're legislated and codified in United States law. If something is codified in the law, obviously it can be violated by a private employer. For example, sexual harassment. Sexual harassment wasn't even known, at least by those words, in the 1770s and 1780s. By 1789, when the Constitution was written, they knew of nothing of the sort. As things like that, civil rights, human rights, sexual harassment, and on, became codified in U.S. code or U.S. federal statutes legislated by the United States Congress later on, then those things become violations of federal law. They are not violations of the Constitution unless some further amendment to the Constitution, for example, the 14th Amendment, we'll go over that as well, puts something in the Constitution that does now codify it as a right. So we don't have to be constitutional attorneys. I'm not an attorney. That's my disclaimer. I have worked with the Constitution for 35 years. I've taught constitutional law at the college level to police officers and attorneys. But I'm not an attorney licensed by the bar to practice law in the state of Arizona, which is where I'm broadcasting from tonight. So let's go over the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, all of which were put into the Constitution in 1791, fulfilling the guarantee to the signatories of the Constitution that they would be put in there, and they were. The First Amendment, which we're going to go over in pretty good detail starting in this first episode, is the rights of freedom of religion, free speech, free press, assembly, and petitioning of grievances. Now, we'll go over that in great detail. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. We'll spend an episode going over that and some of the case law as well. The Third Amendment, which we're not going to spend much time on, is about quartering of troops in residential homes by the government. The British had been quartering troops or housing troops in colonial residences by force, by proclamation, not by request. And the colonialists in the Constitution writing said, no, we want to make sure our government doesn't do that in the future. That's about all we're going to say about the Third Amendment. The Fourth Amendment, this is a major amendment. The Fourth Amendment we will spend quite a bit of time on here in the following shows. The Fourth Amendment is search and seizure. It also covers use of force, especially use of deadly force by police officers. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time with the Fourth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment, of course, has to do with basically self-incrimination, double jeopardy, grand juries. This is the Fifth Amendment that's the foundation of what you may know of as the Miranda warning. You know, where the police go, you have the right to remain silent. If that's the Miranda warning, which came out of Miranda versus Arizona, in fact, a court case that we'll go over when we talk about the Fourth Amendment. We will also deal with a recent search warrant by the FBI in southern Florida at a place called Mar-a-Lago, not far from where I worked a few years ago. So we'll talk about that and where we are at that point with the Fourth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment, of course, as we talked about, is Miranda, self-incrimination, and gets into due process. The Sixth Amendment is basically the jury trial due process, right to confront and to counsel. We'll spend a little bit of time there, but not much. The Seventh Amendment deals with common law suits and jury trials, and we're not going to say much about the Seventh. The Eighth Amendment we'll spend a little bit of time with is excessive bail or fines and cruel and unusual punishment, which comes up occasionally in our court cases. The Ninth Amendment talks about non-enumerated rights, and we'll do a little bit of time on that. The 10th Amendment, which we're going to spend quite a bit of time on, was, in fact, a major factor lately in a recent Supreme Court decision having to do with abortion. The 10th Amendment talks about the rights reserved to states, if not specifically enumerated to the federal government. We'll talk about that in some length and talk about the Dodge case that the Supreme Court just went over and what its impact on Roe v. Wade, 77 case, I believe. We'll look at that and see when we deal with the 10th Amendment. Now, before we go over the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, there's one other layer that we need to throw on here that we haven't yet talked about. A review of civics shows us that there are three branches of government. There's the executive branch, which includes the presidency, the White House, and the cabinet secretaries. The Department of Defense, Homeland Security, all of those are under the executive branch. Then you have the congressional branch, the legislative branch, which is the U.S. Congress, normally thought of as just a House of Representatives, the lower house, but it also includes the upper house, which is the United States Senate. Both of those together are the U.S. Congress, and normally, following protocol and rules, the House of Representatives starts with legislation, They vote on it. If they approve something, then it goes to the Senate. If the Senate approves the same thing, then it goes to the President to be signed. If the Senate comes up with something that's a little bit different than the House, then they get into a kind of a compromise committee where they will discuss and come to satisfaction on a package that they're happy with. And then that package has to go both back to the House of Representatives, sorry if I bumped you, and the U.S. Senate for each to vote on it. Once they approve it, then it goes to the President. There's a third branch that comes in here, and that's the Supreme Court of the United States. Bear in mind, and this is important as we go through these amendments, the Supreme Court of the United States has one job. Under the United States Constitution, it has one job, and that is to provide checks and balances for the other two branches of government by interpreting the United States Constitution. Now, what do I mean by that? You know, the Founding Fathers weren't stupid. They weren't drunkards. They were some pretty smart people. They knew that as the years would go on, cultural changes, linguistic changes, interpretive changes, and all of those changes would make it difficult for people to understand exactly what they intended when they wrote the amendments. As we go through here, I'm going to read the exact verbiage of that amendment as it was written by the Founding Fathers. At the time, they knew that come 1800, 1900, 2000, here we are 2022, almost 250 years from the time of the signing of and ratification of the Constitution, that things would change. People would speak differently. People would understand things based on the context of their environment, their cultural mores and values, which would all be somewhat different than it was in 1789, or in this case, 1791. So they wrote in there for the United States Supreme Court to be the arbiter, truly the Supreme Court, to deal with federal constitutional issues and interpret the Constitution. That's their only job. The Supreme Court deals with constitutional issues, and that's it. They do that in order to provide checks and balances for the other two branches of government, which also provide checks and balances for their other two branches. In other words, the executive branch has checks and balances over legislative and the Supreme Court. The legislative branch has checks and balances over the Supreme Court and the executive. So the intent there was that the authority and responsibility of government would be equally shared between the three branches, so that no one branch could monopolize government to the point that they would once again have a monarch or a king who would be a dictator. So The Supreme Court, in all of these amendments that we're going to go over, has the constitutional authority and obligation to interpret that amendment in contemporary values dealing with contemporary cases. Some of those cases we're going to go over starting tonight with the First Amendment. So what does the First Amendment say? The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Whew. That's a lot of words and a lot of theory and a lot of convention that's there in the First Amendment. When we think of the First Amendment, we usually think of it as free speech and freedom of religion. Now let's look at that. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, which the courts since then have interpreted to mean that the Constitution, the government, cannot tell people what religion they're supposed to be or not, and provides for a separation of what we call church and state. The separation of church and state is a foundation of our Constitution. That's forever in litigation all the way up to the Supreme Court, and we'll deal a little bit in that. Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In other words, the government can't keep you from exercising your religion or your lack of religion. Currently, there are almost 400 registered religions in the United States of America. It goes on then, or abridging the freedom of speech. That little clause there is what we're going to spend the next episode and a half about here, because that talks about free speech. Now, what is free speech? We all know that we cannot yell fire in a crowded theater unless there's a real fire in there. If we yell fire because we think it's a joke and somebody gets hurt, now we are liable for that injury because that no longer is under free speech. And there have been cases about that. Now, we're not going to go into each and every case. This isn't a class on any of the amendments. But it's important to understand that things like libel, slander, and defamation of character are all interpreted under the right of free speech to be compartmentalized under there by court order and different court actions and cases that have taken place that have articulated what each of those are and where the limits of free speech are, how they restrict. For example, one thing that I always try to convince people of, when we're writing something on Facebook, it's one thing to say, well, the courts suck. Family court sucks. And because of blah, blah, blah. Okay. I have a right of free speech. I can say that. Whether it's true or not is another matter, but I can say that. But now, for me to say, Well, Judge Roberts is a thief, and he has done this and this and this to steal from my family and these families and other families and make allegations of criminal conspiracy or action publicly on social media or any other media. That's where we run into problems. Now, I've, from time to time, tried to convince people not to do that. The reply I usually get is, why not? It's true. Well, first of all, keep in mind that if you're making public allegations against someone, that someone can come back on you and accuse you of libel, slander, defamation, of, depending on whether it's oral or written or what you're doing. They can come back on you and file suit against you in federal court. Now, if you've ever had a suit against you, you know that even if you're in the right, even if you know you're going to prevail and that you're not going to lose your house and your family and your job, it's still incredibly stressful to go through a civil suit. It just is. Believe me, the last federal civil suit I went through was a wrongful termination of employment suit. It lasted 5 years in the federal courts, and we never went to court. That was all the paperwork and the orders and discovery and all of those things. Now, as I use certain terminology and legal terms to you, I'm just going to use some surface terms that you need to understand. If you're going to go into court, and a lot of you do, or you have in the past, you know very well that it's a little bit like going out onto a diamond and not knowing what a baseball is. You're going to be in trouble. Now, we can joke about that, but those of us who have been in court a lot, now remember, I was a police officer. I spent 35 years as a cop. I had over 400 appearances in court, all the way from a local municipal court, through county district, through state appeals, through federal courts. 400 appearances where I testified or provided evidence or something of the sort. I'm fairly comfortable working my way around the courtroom. But if you're not, if you haven't been there hundreds of times, and most of you haven't, then you need to be able to understand just the basics. If you walk into a courtroom and you don't know if this woman is the clerk of court or the judge or the prosecutor, and you don't know what prosecutor means, you've got a problem. You need to understand a certain amount of basic legal terminology and linguistics, and be able to articulate yourself and your case and understand that if you're the defendant in a criminal trial and the judge reads a verdict and he says you're guilty, that doesn't mean you should celebrate and go, oh, that's wonderful, I'm so glad, not understanding what that means. So we kind of laugh about that, but it's important that we understand some of the basics. Throughout all of these amendments, there are court cases. Remember, we talked about the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution. So the Supreme Court of the United States and all of its federal courts below it interpret the Constitution. Of all of the district federal courts, for example, the 9th District, which is the West Coast, is the most liberal of all. I worked in the 9th District for a number of years. The federal district courts have jurisdiction over their district. And when they make a constitutional interpretation, which they do all the time, that's the law of the land in their district unless they or the Supreme Court changes it. That's not the law of the land nationally in other districts, although, and this is a major caveat, let's say you have a court case in the 5th District, federal district, which is south. You have a court case there that has already been decided in the 9th District. You're going to play hell trying to beat that decision that has already been made by another district in yours, because that will come up as what's called judicial precedence. And the very first thing that a federal court looks at when they're deciding to adjudicate or deciding the conclusion of a case is judicial precedence. What has already been decided in another court. Now, that's not engraved in stone, but it's very close. So, I've heard some people say, well, that's another district. That doesn't take effect here. Well, I wouldn't be so sure about that. If we have a similar case come up in our district, and another district has already adjudicated the same general constitutional issue, now we've got a problem. Or, if that's what we want, then we're going to take that court case, bring it into our district and say, yo, judiciary branch, the courts, this is what judicial precedent has already found. This is what we believe should be the law of the land here in this district. And now, whoever the other side is, be it plaintiff or defendant, which are the two in civil courts, the plaintiff is the person bringing the suit forth. The defendant is the person the suit is against. In criminal court, the difference is you've got a defendant who has the criminal charges against them, and the prosecution, who prosecutes the case for the people, is the one who has charged the person and now is going into court against the defendant to prove his case. Let's step aside for just a moment before we get back to the First Amendment, because we need to understand the difference in laws in the United States legislature. Remember, you've got state legislatures that make state laws, and you have state courts, you have a state constitution, and you have state courts that adjudicate your state constitution. The state courts cannot adjudicate the federal constitution, and the federal courts do not adjudicate state constitutions, with one exception. Once a case gets to a Supreme Court of a state, it may be taken up by the Supreme Court of the United States. That's not rare, but it's not frequent. On the federal side, when there's an allegation of a violation of the United States Constitution, then the federal courts, beginning with the federal district courts, begin to take up that issue. You don't go directly to the United States Supreme Court. That's very rare. The federal courts at the district level and the appellate level will take up that case. One side or the other can appeal it, and then it can bounce up, and eventually the Supreme Court of the United States may or may not take that case. The Supreme Court gets a whole slew of cases which the federal courts want it to look at over a year. The Supreme Court gets to cherry pick those cases. Generally, it will pick those cases which will make the greatest impact, of which there's the greatest question of some constitutional right or issue. Keep in mind that if the Supreme Court of the United States declines to hear a certain case, that case then goes back down to the federal court level that last adjudicated it, and that's the decision that stands. And the Supreme Court refuses to hear it. It is the law established by that federal court. That goes for civil or criminal, or military for that. The Supreme Court of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ, is the same Supreme Court of the United States that anyone goes to for civil, criminal, military. It's all the same when you get to that level. There is a separate federal court system for the Uniform Code of Military Justice until you get to the Supreme Court. So then we have laws that are legislated by the federal legislature. That is the United States Code, or U.S. Code, is United States law, federal law. There are both civil and criminal laws in there. Now let's explain that for a minute, because it gets confusing. The Congress passes a law and the president signs it. There are millions of those laws in the United States now at the state or federal level. All of those laws have to be legislated at the state level or federal level. You've heard terms like misdemeanor, felony. In order for a law to be a crime, let's back up 1 minute. A law is legislated by the state or federal government. Not all laws are crimes. You can violate a law and it may not be a crime. Don't think for 1 minute that violating every law is a crime. It's not. In order for a law to be a crime, you have to have several things in that law. First off, the legislative body that makes that law has to specifically say it is a crime to violate this law. If they don't say that, it's not a crime. It may be a civil infraction or a violation, but it's not a crime. If a law says that it's a crime to violate that law, then it has to state what class of crime that is. Generally speaking, we have misdemeanors and we have felonies. Now, states may have different classes of misdemeanor and different classes of felony, but those are the two main classifications of crime: misdemeanors and felonies. A misdemeanor means that it's a level of crime that calls for a sentence of less than 1 year in jail, and usually there'll be a fine limit in there too, maybe $100,000 or something like that. A felony calls for incarceration of more than a year and a higher fine. So misdemeanors are your lower class of crime. Felonies are your higher class of crime. There are lower classes below misdemeanor for violations and infractions, but they are not crimes. And that's important to understand. Speeding, for example. Speeding, say 12 miles an hour over the posted speed limit. Generally speaking, is what's called an infraction or a violation. That is a violation of law, and there will be a fine assessed for that, but there can be no incarceration for it unless it is somehow elevated to the level of a crime. For example, I sped 12 miles an hour over the speed limit through a crosswalk with children in it. That then can be something that some states will call aggravated speeding, which makes it a misdemeanor, or careless or reckless driving, which are misdemeanors. So, depending on the situation, everything from the weather to how I do something, crimes can be aggravated to a higher level. Assault is a real good example of that. Simple assault, for example, is where I have assaulted someone with just my fists or hands or feet or something like that, and I'm not a kung fu panda. Aggravated assault or assault with a deadly weapon might include something like a gun or a baseball bat, something for blunt trauma injuries, or shooting somebody would be aggravated assault. So different levels there are misdemeanors or felonies. It's also important to remember one other thing. Some crimes, by their nature, in and of themselves, the legal term, which is per se, to say that what I said was per se in and of itself, as opposed to pro se, which is representing yourself in court as an attorney. I'm pro se. I don't have an attorney. I'm representing myself. Per se, very different in and of itself. Let's take real quick burglary versus robbery. Burglary means somebody has broken in someplace to commit a crime. Usually it means to steal something and then leave, to deprive the owner of that property permanently of that property. Usually burglars are people who don't want to meet up with the owners. They don't want any confrontation. They want to go in when nobody's home. They want to get their stuff and they want to get out quickly. Robbery is a very different crime. Robbery is where one person, the suspect or the perpetrator, sometimes called the perp, which is a TV terminology, not a police or law terminology. The perpetrator accosts the person, and either with or without a weapon. Simple robbery is without a weapon. Armed robbery is with a weapon. Steals something from that person or takes something from that person. Usually money, jewelry, something like that. Purse snatching is robbery. If I go down and I grab somebody's purse and steal it, I took it from the person. I didn't burglarize their home. I took it from them. That's robbery. Now, why is it important to remember these things? Because as we go on with the amendments and we get to these court cases, we'll deal with some of these. The Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment, we're going to deal with the difference between burglaries and robberies and how using the wrong terminology in a court charge can get somebody released who shouldn't be released. Things like that. It matters. Terminology matters. Linguistics matter in the law and under the Constitution. Now, I only have a few minutes left here for part one. So, a couple of things I'm going to throw out at you to understand, and then we'll talk about what's coming up in part two. Obscenity, in general, is not protected speech. In other words, we talk about protected speech under the Constitution. If I have a right to say something, that's protected speech. And it gets kind of fine-tuned in some cases when it comes to things like profanity and fighting words and inciting the public to action. Ding, ding. That's current events as well that we're going to get into there with some of these. Profanity, the court has said, is not protected speech. However, disorderly conduct, which used to be a pretty strict statute in most states, has been thrown out by the Supreme Court under the freedom of speech. It used to be, when I started in law enforcement in 1974, if that makes me look old at all, I started in law enforcement in 1974. At that time, if somebody ran out, and language warning here, we're going to start using some exact language. If somebody came out in the middle of a street at 3 o'clock in the morning and yelled, "Fuck everybody," and then went back in their house, it used to be we could arrest that person for disorderly conduct, which was a misdemeanor. The Supreme Court took two of those points out of the Constitution and said this was protected speech. Profanity, such as just used, if it was used in a general sense and not directed at someone as fighting words. In other words, if I say to you, "fuck you," to your face, and you're a motherfucker, or something to that effect, that comes under fighting words. That's not protected speech. That's speech that's going to get me in trouble here and could get me arrested. Remember, arrest, police, government, Constitution. It's not protected speech. But if I just use the word fuck in a sentence with somebody, that doesn't mean I'm going to get arrested. That's protected speech. If it's just used as an exclamation, as a profanity per se, and not a part of a threat or fighting words, it's protected speech. The second thing to understand that we're going to talk about in part two as well is what's under the Brandenburg test, which is speech that is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action. In other words, the speech is likely to incite or produce such action. Now, we're going to go over that some in part two, because that goes into allegations that were made against Donald Trump, of course, from the January 6th Democratic Committee that I call the Unselect Committee on January 6th. We'll go over that committee and some of the Brandenburg test and how it may impact the adjudication of the committee as it completes its job now and goes into influencing people's votes for the 2022 election. Of course, that in 2024 is what it's all about. My last comment there is Donald Trump is going to come up quite a bit in these shows now from now on, through the amendments and through the current events that we talk about. The 45th President of the United States, of course, is a conservative. He's currently a Republican. Probably will stay a Republican. The Democrats, or the left, the liberals, are desperately trying to get him out of influence for the 2022 election and out of running as president in the 2024 election. Whether they'll be able to do that or not is questionable right now. The liberals have conducted 7, count them 7, investigations now of Donald Trump over the last 7 years. They have yet to find anything of substance to charge him with criminally or to keep him from running for president, which is obviously their intent. It's the intent of the January 6th committee. Don't even try telling me that the January 6th committee is about accountability of anybody else except Donald Trump and his supporters. Don't even try telling me that the mission of the January 6th Unselect Committee, the Democratic Committee, is out for justice. BS. The January 6th Committee, and we'll take some time to look at that in Part 2, and how it functions under the Brandenburg test, and how, in fact, an impeachment even functioned under the Brandenburg test, and they lost it, basically on those grounds. We'll go over all of that in the next several shows. This is going to be the end of Part 1. This is Episode 3. The first and second episodes are already out there on YouTube. I ask you to subscribe to YouTube channel as you watch those. Please subscribe. Leave a comment whether you like it or not. We'll talk in Part 2 a little bit about some of the comments and messages we've received. Some are more colorful than others. And that's fine. I understand and accept anybody's viewpoint about what I talk about. Whether you agree with me or you don't, you're welcome to watch all of these webcasts, to leave comments, to leave messages, thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever your preference is. Let us know. And if you don't like something, please articulate that. Please tell us what you don't like. Don't just leave us some profane, vile message or comment, and we've had some of those, and we'll give you some of those at the start of Part 2 coming next. This is going to be a 3-part series on the First Amendment. Part 2 will go over the Brandenburg test and its impact on the investigations of Donald Trump and the January 6th committee. We'll get into that in great detail in Part 2. In Part 3, we have an interview of a Facebook colleague of mine, someone I worked with in the past, who has been repeatedly suspended in his account because of posts that he has made. Censorship. We'll be looking at that. We'll be hearing from him and watching the interview that I conducted with him a couple of months ago now. So that's the end of part 1 of the First Amendment. That's one of the amendments we're going to deal with in great detail. I thank you. I ask you, don't forget to subscribe, please, and leave us your thumbs up, thumbs down, comments, whatever it may be. And from my family to yours, I bid you be safe.